My son abandoned me after the funeral. But what my husband left behind changed everything. This isn't the title of a movie. It's a true story, one that left millions of Americans stunned when it began circulating across family and legal forums. A mother, left alone in the woods just days after her husband's funeral. No money, no electricity, no explanation. A letter, a voice recording, and a truth so powerful it silenced an entire courtroom. I couldn't hold back tears when I heard this story. And this video, it's proof that love, even when forgotten, always finds its way back. The chilly afternoon wind threaded its way through rows of bare trees, tugging at the thin mourning scarf draped over Margaret's shoulder. She stood alone, apart from the white folding chairs hastily set beneath the canopy. It was James's funeral, her husband. And it was so simple, so stripped down that no one had even remembered to bring flowers. Just the minister's steady voice, the quiet thud of earth falling onto the casket, and a few handshakes cold as the October air. No music, no flowers, just a man lowered into the ground and a life that felt forgotten. James had never been someone people stayed close to, and Margaret, after more than 30 years as his wife, was now no one. Not in their eyes. She didn't cry. There were no warm tears left to fall. Because when you've been alone for too long, even grief runs out of things to say. When the ceremony ended, David, their only son, walked over. No questions. No embrace. Just a quiet sentence, "I'll drive you home." Margaret nodded. She no longer expected anything from him. The car pulled away slowly. In the rearview mirror, the cemetery gate drifted backward, smaller and smaller. But the cold in her chest, that never left. Evening was settling in when David turned onto a narrow dirt road, grass overgrown and patchy along both sides. Margaret glanced out the window quietly, wondering why they weren't taking the main route home. But she didn't ask. Maybe it was a shortcut, she told herself. Wind rushed in through a cracked window, carrying the musty scent of forest and rotting bark. The car drove for another 30 minutes before stopping in the middle of a remote stretch of red earth. No houses, no signs, just a small wooden cabin tucked between pine trees, its roof slanted, its paint faded. David didn't cut the engine. He stepped out, opened the trunk, then came back. "This is where you get off." Margaret turned, thinking she'd misheard. But David was already pulling her old suitcase from the trunk, along with a thick envelope. He placed both at her feet. "We talked about this," he said flatly. "You can stay here for a while. Everything's ready." Everything was ready except her heart. She looked at her son, searching for an explanation, or even just a trace of tenderness in his eyes. But David simply stood there, hands in his coat pockets, his gaze blank as if she were a stranger. No embrace. No goodbye. Not even a glance back. When the car turned and disappeared around the bend, Margaret didn't move. Beside her, an old suitcase, dust-covered, an unopened envelope. In front, a strange cabin. Behind her, the road they came from, and with it, a quiet, unmistakable kind of abandonment. Not just of a place, but of a mother. Margaret picked up the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, no money, no instructions, just a single piece of paper folded into quarters. Faint yellow. The handwriting. Slanted familiar, like the old letters James used to send her when they were young. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you till the end, but you have to know. You deserve better than this." Just one line, but it roared through her chest like a storm. Margaret sat on the wooden step, holding the paper, as if her heart had fallen through her hands. Because sometimes a single sentence hits harder than a lifetime of silence. It was a long while before she stood again. The sun was fading, leaving streaks of dull gold across the trees. She walked to the cabin door. The brass nameplate was tarnished. Letters barely visible: Willard, 1952. The name rang a distant bell. Willard was James's uncle, a recluse. Rumor had it he died alone, and no one even noticed. The door wasn't locked. Margaret pushed it gently. The hinges groaned. Inside it was dim and thick with dust, like time itself had been forgotten here. Cobwebs stretched from an old bookshelf to a ceiling lamp. On the table, a cracked porcelain cup. Beside it, a rocking chair with a missing leg. This wasn't a home, not a retreat. It was a place you put what you want to forget. Margaret stood in the center of the room, eyes scanning the stillness. The air smelled of damp wood, old age, and quiet abandonment. She folded the note and placed it over her heart. And for the first time in years, she heard her own breath. The breath of someone who'd just been pushed to the edge of life and left there. That afternoon, after brushing off the dust from the single chair by the window, Margaret sat down. She watched as sunlight slipped through the trees, casting scattered shadows on the wooden floor. No phone signal. No calls. No laughter of children. No familiar clatter from the kitchen. Just the soft whistle of wind through old window cracks, and memories rolling in like a film that had been waiting to play. Margaret had once been a standout nursing student, offered a full scholarship by a major hospital in Seattle. But in her second year, she became pregnant with David. James had just started as the foreman at a local machine shop. When his mother had a stroke, Margaret packed up her life and moved into his family's home, putting her dreams of the hospital on hold. David was born frail, always feverish, always crying. There were nights she didn't sleep at all, just sat beside his crib, rubbing his back, wiping him down with warm water. She'd set an alarm every 4 hours to give him his cough syrup, cooked special porridge for every time he reacted to formula. No one ever mentioned it, but it was Margaret, only Margaret, who pulled her son through each case of pneumonia, each seizure brought on by high fevers, all without stepping foot into a major hospital, because they couldn't afford it. No praise, no headlines, just a mother, doing everything she could with nothing. She also cut her husband's hair every month, cooked 3 meals a day for her in-laws for 12 straight years, even when her fingers ached from arthritis. No spa days, no vacations, not a single birthday party done properly. But she never complained, because in her heart, that was love. She didn't wait for praise, didn't expect repayment, just a look of understanding. A hug on David's wedding day. A quiet thank you, Mom, when he held his firstborn. But now sitting alone in a weathered cabin deep in the woods, Margaret finally understood. No one ever looked back. No one remembered the way she remembered every fever, every tear. Maybe, all these years, her love had been invisible, used, then forgotten. On her first morning after being left behind, Margaret woke before the sun. Not because of an alarm, there was no electricity here, no ringing bells, but because of the cold sinking into her spine, and the sound of wind slicing through the cracks in the rotting wood. Light crept in through the foggy window pane, just enough for her to see her breath rising in the air. The cabin had no power, just an old wood-burning stove, a rain barrel tucked beneath the eaves, and a narrow spring bed that creaked every time she turned. In the kitchen, a few dusty cans of beans, a half-empty bottle of cooking oil, and a bag of damp, clumped salt. Margaret didn't eat that morning. She just changed into a coat, slipped on a pair of rubber boots with cracked soles, and began walking to the nearest grocery store. Nearly 4 miles. Wind whipped against her face. Mud caked to her ankles. But she didn't feel tired. Sometimes The pain in your heart outweighs the pain in your body. The grocery store was a small wooden shack with a tin roof nestled just off the highway. The owner was a middle-aged man named Ray, polite but quiet. Margaret bought a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, some candles, and a bar of soap. Ray bagged her items without a single question. She was grateful for that. Because sometimes you don't want to tell your story, you just want to survive it. That evening, Margaret lit a fire using torn scraps of paper she found in an old drawer. She sliced a thin piece of bread and dipped it into cold milk. That was her first dinner. Outside, the rain began to fall, dripping steadily into the plastic barrel by the door. It was the only sound in the house. Each night under candlelight, she wrote in an old journal. The cover wine-colored velvet had once belonged to James. She recorded the date, the weather, and little things no one else would notice. Gray clouds. Rain started at 4 p.m. Back pain spread to left hip. Dreamt I was young again, in a wedding dress. James didn't come. No one called. No one visited. No signs that she existed in anyone else's life anymore. But each time her pen touched paper, Margaret felt she hadn't vanished completely. Because as long as she could write, there was still proof that she had loved, that she had hurt, and that some part of her was still here, learning how to exist in the dark and in the silence. A week after arriving at the cabin, Margaret spent an entire afternoon writing a letter to David. She began with 3 words. My dear son, then stopped. The pen hovered mid-air, uncertain whether to continue with anger, disappointment, or forgiveness. The letter stretched nearly 10 pages. She wrote about the nights she held David in her arms at the hospital when he had pneumonia, the mornings she skipped breakfast just to save enough money for the better cough syrup, the quiet evenings when James worked the night shift and it was just the 2 of them, mother and son, eating boiled eggs in a cold kitchen. Not to guilt him, not to list her sacrifices, but to remind David that once love had been visible, tangible, real. But as she neared the end, Margaret's hand froze. She couldn't bring herself to write the final sentence. Couldn't write, I love you, without feeling something twist in her chest. She folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, but didn't mail it. It stayed tucked inside a desk drawer beside the handkerchief she'd held the day David graduated high school. Some words hurt more when they're written down, and some goodbyes never make it past the envelope. Over a week later, the first mail carrier appeared. An old man with silver hair, in a wrinkled uniform, and a faded baseball cap. His name tag, barely legible, read, George. He didn't speak much, just handed her the mail, nodded politely. But Margaret always left a glass of water on the porch, a habit she once had with the milkmen long ago. After a few visits, George began lingering. One day, light rain fell. He took shelter under the porch roof, then asked softly, You live here alone? Margaret nodded. No explanation. After a pause, George sat on the wooden chair, removed his damp cap. His voice was deep, slow. I lived alone once, too. After my wife passed, my daughter moved away. No one called. No one wrote. Just me. And an empty mailbox every day. Margaret looked at him. Her gaze softened. George gave a weary smile. Not everyone knows how to love the person who gave everything for them, Miss Margaret. That kind of truth doesn't need to be loud. It just sits in the air and stays with you. When he left, Margaret didn't say a word. But that night, she opened the drawer, pulled out the letter, and read it again. Every line. Then she sighed, folded it carefully, and placed it right back where it was. Because sometimes leaving things unsaid makes it easier to breathe, and some love The deepest kind doesn't need to be sent. It just needs to be held. One morning in mid-month, as Margaret folded the sun-warmed blanket off the porch railing, a strange car pulled up outside the gate. A young driver stepped out and handed her an envelope from a law office in the city. Inside was a letter A, formal request for her to come in and confirm documentation related to James's will. The appointment was scheduled for next week. A round-trip bus ticket was enclosed. Margaret took the early morning bus. The city was crowded, noisy, nothing like the damp, quiet world she'd grown used to. She sat still by the window, hands clenched around her old purse, unsure if she should feel anxious or hopeful. A will, she thought. But surely there wouldn't be much. James had been a factory worker. Their life was simple. No big savings. No property portfolio. But when she stepped into the law office, something shifted. The formal air. The receptionist's quiet nod. The way everything seemed prepared. George Farley, James's personal attorney for over a decade, stood to greet her, shaking her hand with both of his. "Mrs. Harper, thank you so much for coming," he said, his eyes carrying a silence that hinted at something harder to say. In a small conference room, he opened the file. "Your husband left his entire estate to you," he explained. "That includes the old house, his retirement account, and a portion of his life insurance. Everything is clear and legally sound." Margaret said nothing. Not because the sum was surprising, it wasn't much, but because for the first time in her life, she felt like someone had put her first. But Mr. Farley wasn't finished. He pulled out another file and placed it gently on the table. "There's something else. Your son David has filed a petition with the court to assume financial guardianship." Margaret blinked. "In the documents," Farley continued, "he states that you've shown signs of psychological instability after the funeral and are unfit to manage your own finances." Margaret didn't speak. She simply stared at the folder as if it were the final scratch that split open what little trust she still had left. Mr. Farley opened a drawer, pulled out a small voice recorder. "James left this," he said quietly. "He told me, if Margaret ever has to hear this, it means what I feared most has come true." He pressed play. James's voice came through gravelly slow. "My love, if you're hearing this, it means David has lost his way. I love our son, but I saw the changes in him after he married. Isabel isn't easy. I fear that once I'm gone, she'll use David like a tool. If she makes him choose between you and her, I don't know if he'll choose right. Don't blame him, but protect yourself. You deserve peace." Margaret sat motionless. She didn't cry, just placed a trembling hand over her chest, where her fragile heart seemed to fold in on itself. As if recognizing a prophecy finally come true, she signed the inheritance confirmation, thanked Mr. Farley, and stepped out of the office as the sun dipped low behind the buildings. On the bus ride back through the forest roads, Margaret didn't think. She wasn't angry. She wasn't sad. There was only one truth: she had been pushed out of her son's life. Not because she was poor, but because others thought she was weak. But now, they were wrong. The hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning, and the sky was overcast, as if even the weather knew something heavy was about to unfold inside that small county courtroom. Margaret arrived early, dressed in a light gray sweater, its cuffs worn thin but pressed neat and clean. In her hands, a thick folder, bound with a frayed rubber band. Everything she had, the evidence, the memories, and the last of her dignity, was inside that file. David came last, hand in hand with Isabel. She looked polished, black dress hair in a sleek bun, an air of confidence just a bit too practiced. Isabel was the kind of woman who knew exactly which words to say, exactly when to smile, and exactly how long to blink. But when Margaret's gaze passed over her, she noticed Isabel never once looked back. Her eyes always avoided hers. Sometimes cowardice wears the mask of politeness. When the judge entered, the air seemed to freeze. Margaret's lawyer, Ellen Rollins, spoke slowly, but with quiet authority. She presented James's original will, complete with verified signatures and a notarized seal. Then came the audio recording. James's voice filled the room, slow, low, but never weak, like a message from another world. Isabel shifted in her seat. When Ellen began addressing Margaret's mental stability, Isabel suddenly stood. "Your Honor," she said sweetly, "Mrs. Margaret has shown signs of confusion lately. She's been living alone in the woods. No electricity, no plumbing. Surely that suggests she's not in the right state of mind." The judge looked up from his notes. "Do you have any specific evidence to support that claim?" Isabel pressed her lips together. She glanced at David, waiting for backup, but he said nothing. His head stayed bowed, fingers interlaced, motionless, eyes fixed on his knees. She turned back to the judge. "It's just a concern from the family, Your Honor." Ellen allowed herself the faintest smile. "She lives in that cabin because her son, Mr. David Harper, left her there, with no power, no transportation, right after her husband's funeral." She paused. "And if that is a sign of instability, perhaps we should be asking Mr. David why he made that choice." For a moment, the courtroom fell completely silent. Isabel opened her mouth to object, but the judge raised his hand. "That's enough." He replayed the audio recording, every word, all the way through. Then he examined James's handwritten note, comparing the script to a signature from 10 years prior. Finally, the judge looked up. After reviewing all documentation and testimony, he said it is clear that the will is valid and reflects the final wishes of Mr. James Harper. There is no evidence that Mrs. Margaret Harper lacks mental capacity or exhibits cognitive decline. A long, deliberate pause. Therefore, the full estate is granted to Margaret Harper. The petition for financial guardianship is denied. Isabel's fingers tightened around David's, but Margaret saw it. He didn't tighten back. He just sat there, silent, like a child caught doing something he couldn't undo. The judge closed the folder, tapped his gavel gently. "This hearing is adjourned." Margaret stood, no glance back, no words for her son. But inside her, something closed. Not sadness, but expectation. And at the same time, something else began to open. Something she'd thought she'd lost her dignity. On the drive back from court, the air inside the car was thick like fog before a storm. Isabel sat in the passenger seat, clutching her purse tight, her lips pressed in fury. David kept his eyes on the road, not speaking. But inside his mind tangled a burned-out mess of old wires and short circuits. Finally, Isabel snapped. "You're weak," she hissed. "If it weren't for me, your mother would have taken everything a long time ago." David still said nothing. But her words, they weren't just anger. They were an admission that everything that had happened had been part of a plan. Isabel's plan. He didn't respond, didn't have the strength anymore, not to argue, not to defend himself. That night, after Isabel slammed the bedroom door and locked it from the inside, David sat alone in the attic. He opened a worn box, the one his mother had given him before he got married. Inside were old photographs, his mother cradling him in a thick winter blanket, a tired smile, but gentle. Some of the photos had yellowed. One had a water stain like it had once been held by a hand too full of tears. His hands trembling, David reopened the letter James had written to Margaret, a copy the lawyer had given him to keep. By the final line, he couldn't hold it back. The tears came. Not the tears of a grown man, but of a child who had once believed that his parents were walls that would never fall. The next morning, just as Margaret was steeping her first pot of tea, the cabin door suddenly creaked open. Wind swept in, carrying the scent of wet leaves and hurried footsteps. She turned tea kettle still in hand. David stood there. No expensive coat. No hardened posture. He dropped to his knees at the porch, step eyes, red voice raw. "I'm sorry, Mom. I let someone else control me. I forgot. I forgot who got me through that first winter." Margaret didn't speak, for so long that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then she placed her hand gently on his shoulder. Not to forgive, but to begin again from a place where lies no longer lived. Margaret said nothing. She simply placed her steaming teacup on the old wooden table, then stepped forward to the porch, where David still knelt silently. No scolding. No tears. She bent down, wrapped her arms around her son, as if holding the child he once was. Frail, clinging, needing warmth that only one person in the world could give. The embrace didn't last long, but it lasted long enough. Long enough for David to understand there are sacred things that cannot be broken, not by time, not by misunderstanding, not even by betrayal. They don't vanish. They just wait for someone brave enough to return. Weeks later, Isabel left. No legal disputes. No farewell note. She simply vanished one autumn morning, heels clicking down the wooden steps, suitcase in hand. No one stopped her. And strangely, no one missed her. David began returning to the cabin every weekend. He repaired the porch, replaced the doorknob, planted lavender by the old iron stove. Margaret never asked why, never commented. But each morning she made an extra cup of tea and set it on the opposite chair. Sometimes it was finished. Sometimes it wasn't. But the cup was always there, because some love waits quietly, without questions, without conditions. One quiet afternoon, as golden sunlight spilled across the newly patched roof, David walked in carrying a wooden picture frame, still fresh with the scent of varnish. He placed it gently on the table. Inside was an old photo, Margaret cradling him as an infant, her lips pressed softly to his forehead, her eyes tired, but full of love. Below the photo, etched by hand, she never let go, even when I did. And on the back, faintly penciled, "Some wounds take years to open, but some love never stops waiting."